Now we have Professor Biman Prasad, who is the former Professor of Economics and Developmental Studies in University of South Pacific. Presently, he is the Member of Parliament and the leader of National Federation Party, Shadow Minister of Finance, Planning and National Statistics, and Chairman of Fijian Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee in Fiji.
Please continue.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very pleased to join the distinguished panelists for this seminar. Obviously, we in Fiji have a slightly different situation. You know, we only had 18 cases so far. 14 obviously have recovered. So in effect, we have only 4 active cases in Fiji right now. We were able to close the borders around end of March. And the view is that in Fiji and obviously other Pacific Island countries as well, seem to have had very few cases of COVID-19, and in some of the other smaller Pacific countries like Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga, and others, there's been no cases. I think the issue for us here in the Pacific, and in particular in Fiji, is the economic fallout that is going to come as a result of the COVID-19. And right now in Fiji, we have a situation where about 40% of our GDP comes from tourism, and we receive a large amount of remittances as well. So our economy rests on tourism, remittances, and the ability of some of our workers from the Pacific, particularly seasonal workers that go to Australia, New Zealand to work. And obviously the health issues remain at the forefront of the measures that Pacific governments, in particular government here in Fiji, has put forward. So for us, the issue right now is how the economic fallout is going to be addressed. Much of our tourists also come from Australia and New Zealand. In fact, Australia and New Zealand combined represent about 60 to 65% of the total number of tourists that visit Fiji. Australia, of course, more than New Zealand, gets a large number of seasonal workers, particularly guest workers from Europe. And here there might be opportunities for Fiji and the Pacific Island countries, because it's possible that for a long time yet to come, guest workers from Europe and other places into Australia and New Zealand may not be as high, or may not be possible to get, given the uncertainty surrounding how long COVID-19 is going to prevail and how soon the borders are open for people to move. So essentially, there are opportunities for people from the Pacific when they look at Australia, New Zealand, and how it is all going to play out in the next couple of months. There's been talk about the trans-Tasman travel bubble, and both Australia and New Zealand are discussing among themselves as to how soon and when it would be feasible for them to open the borders. Then there is this talk about how the Pacific countries could be included in the travel bubble. And so there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to when the borders are going to be open. And of course, the opening of the border or borders between the Pacific countries, including Fiji, with Australia and New Zealand, is going to determine the short-term or the medium-term economic impact on the countries in the Pacific. When we look at how the Pacific countries are going to be affected and how people would be able to move from one country to another. So essentially what is really of concern to Pacific economies, and many of them, of course, are dependent on tourists from Australia and New Zealand. For example, Fiji, Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga. These are mostly tourism dependent economies. And there's a lot of movement of people from these countries to Australia and New Zealand. And as I said before, we have a very good seasonal worker program from the Pacific to the two developed partners, Australia and New Zealand. And many of these so-called seasonal or migrant workers bring in a lot of remittances to the Pacific countries. And as I said, many of these economies, particularly economies like Tonga and Samoa, are heavily dependent on remittances, largely from Australia and New Zealand. And so there is a lot of uncertainty with respect to when the borders are going to open, how soon and on what conditions, and whether even after opening the borders, whether people would still feel comfortable traveling to these countries. So I think when you look at COVID-19 and the impact it is going to have on the movement of people is of central importance to many of the Pacific countries, because the economies, as I said, are mainly dependent on movement of people, particularly tourists to these countries. So, it is absolutely vital. I think there's a lot of discussion in terms of post-COVID relationship between Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. I mean, the idea of a Pacific community, the idea of a much more deeper, meaningful regional integration, which could lead to a more open borders rather than what we have right now, could be possibilities in the post-COVID scenario. So obviously there'll be a lot of discussion as to how Pacific countries relate to Australia and New Zealand. And people like myself, I advocate a much more deeper, meaningful regional integration. And I've talked about in an article which I did recently about a broader Pacific community and how some of the restrictions on the borders with respect to the movement of people, movement of goods and services, and eventually movement of people between Pacific countries and Australia and New Zealand would be some of the important considerations for discussion within the Pacific Forum, which includes Australia and New Zealand together with the 14 Forum Island countries. So I think post-COVID, it may take quite a while before we open the borders, is going to throw out some interesting possibilities with respect to the economies in the Pacific and how these countries relate to Australia and New Zealand, and how Australia and New Zealand, for example, see possibilities and opportunities in the post-COVID-19 era or scenario to deal with the Pacific countries and
Kindly wrap up.
Yeah, and ensure that our economies benefit from those kind of look at the way in which Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific countries relate to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Thank you for giving us a complete picture of what is happening.